It's a great pleasure to be joined today by George Monbiot, who is a best-selling author, Guardian columnist, environmental activist, and whose latest book is Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. It's really great to have you on, and this is a conversation that could start in any number of points, but maybe let's start it this way. I think many of us now realize intuitively that planning on indefinite growth on a planet of limited resources mathematically makes little sense. There's something that we recognize there intuitively. However, there are various perspectives as to what the sort of real big issue is, whether it is transportation emissions, fossil fuels, eating meat, whatever the case may be. What's the best way to frame the problem to be solved, and what is the most sensible approach to solving that problem?
So the problem is the gathering collapse of Earth systems. It's not a climate problem. It's not a soil problem. It's not a forest problem. It's not a fish problem. It's not a transport problem. It's not an anything else problem. It's an everything problem. It's all Earth systems together are suffering massive strain as a result of human activity. And these are our life support systems. These are what sustain this remarkable, beautiful, diverse, abundant planet on which we are so lucky to live. And all these Earth systems are complex systems, which means a very specific thing. They're self-organizing and they're self-stabilizing within a range of stress, but you push them beyond that range and the self-organizing properties become self-amplifying, and they then amplify shocks passing across the network until the point when they hit their critical threshold and collapse into a different equilibrium state.
Can you give a couple of examples of that? Because it may, in the abstract,
Yeah.
it may not be obvious what that means.
Well, a classic example was the Great Dust Bowl, which you in North America will be well familiar with. In fact, it's one of many dust bowls that have happened over history, but it's the one that everyone knows about. And soil is a complex system. It's a fascinating, extraordinary ecosystem from which we get 99% of our calories. But if you hit it and hit it and hit it repeatedly with bad plowing, with other bad decisions in agriculture, then you degrade it and degrade it, and you might not notice very much to begin with. You'll notice perhaps a slight drop off in crop yield, few other issues taking place, but it's still there, still seems to be functioning okay. But what's happened is that, unbeknown to you, it has lost its resilience. And then an external shock comes along, like a major drought. And instead of damping down that shock and regulating itself as a healthy system does, this degraded system amplifies that shock and suddenly collapses. And the rate of erosion, of soil erosion, when it's highly degraded and hit by a major drought, can rise 6,000-fold more or less overnight. It just falls off a cliff. And then the soil, which stays on the land because it's a biological structure, like a coral reef, it's built by the little creatures that live in it. Because that biological function has collapsed, the structure completely collapses, and then it can literally blow away. It can just blow away in the wind or wash away with the rain, and suddenly there's no soil on the land. And that's what happened in the Great Dust Bowl and many other dust bowls. But it's what happens in different ways to every kind of complex system. Another one which very nearly collapsed was the financial system in 2008. And again, very similar reasons. It behaves in an almost identical fashion, bizarrely, and it's self-organizing without human agency. Obviously, there's human agency involved, but the human agency doesn't control the structural dynamics within that system. And it came within a whisker of collapse. And it was only a bailout globally amounting to trillions of dollars that prevented that complete collapse into a new equilibrium state, which would have been very hard indeed to come back from.
Speaking of equilibrium states, I'm curious your thoughts to pick one area that you've written about and that is a big subject of discussion. When we talk about, for example, our food system, There are a number of different perspectives about what particular aspect of it is problematic and sort of individual as well as collective decisions that can and arguably should be made. One perspective is, well, it's really about which foods are being eaten. And for example, if we went off completely of animal agriculture and replaced protein with, this is not groundbreaking stuff here, right? We're talking about soy and almond and all these different things, then we would just be much better off. And then the counter to that has been, well, almond and avocado, extraordinarily water intensive. They're transporting bees to the west coast of the US. Half the bees die. So by number of organisms, you're doing damage in a different way. What about the idea of a regenerative type of agriculture, which is less about do we include animal products or not, but using land in a different way? And there's some interesting pilot projects of this being done in the United States. And the counter to that becomes, well, that's really lovely for, I forget the guy's name in Virginia who's doing it, but that's not that useful if you're then transporting that food across the country or whatever. So it becomes really difficult for the quote average person to really know what should I do and what should we do as a society. How do we parse some of these discussions?
Yeah, no, well, these are all the right questions. The first thing is that the term regenerative has become a bit like the term sustainable. It's slapped in front of anything you happen already to be doing. So regenerative ranching, formerly known as ranching.
Right.
And it hasn't been used for very long, but it's already completely lost its meaning. And everyone says, oh, well, yes, of course, what I'm doing is regenerative. And you say, okay, regenerative of what? What are you regenerating here? So in some parts of the US and certainly where I live in the United Kingdom, if it's to be ecologically regenerative, one of the absolute baseline conditions for that is that trees can return to a formerly forested land. If there were once trees on your land and the trees are not coming back, that is not an ecologically regenerative system. That's a really, really basic measure of whether it's ecologically regenerative or not. And of course, agricultural systems, they don't let trees come back spontaneously because, either you're plowing the land or you're grazing animals, which selectively browse out tree seedlings because they're very tasty and nutritious. So that's not going to happen. So ecologically, it doesn't even meet the most basic, the crudest measure of what regenerative means. In terms of keeping soil on the land, there's no doubt that some systems are better at doing that than others. But against it, you must weigh how much are they producing. So what you've got to measure against this idea of how well it's protecting the soil is also how much it's producing. So if you've got a very extensive system occupying a huge amount of land, not doing very much damage to the soil, but not producing very much either, that can be just as damaging in all sorts of other ways as a very intensive system, which is doing more damage to the soil, but producing lots of food. And the reason for that is the massive ecological opportunity costs and carbon opportunity costs of extensive farming. And what that means is that every hectare or every acre of land that you're using could have been supporting a wild ecosystem if you weren't using it. It could have been supporting a forest or a natural grassland or a savanna or a wetland, all of which are crucial ecosystems. And the great majority of the world's species depend on wild ecosystems for their survival. So a lot of what's called regenerative is just actually extensive. It's low yield farming occupying a lot of land, and that's agricultural sprawl. And just like urban sprawl, agricultural sprawl is a very bad thing. We should be leaving as much land as we possibly can for nature. So the holy grail, what we really need to look for, is farming which has high yield and low impact. And that's a really hard thing to achieve. A few farmers are managing to do that. And we should celebrate that and find ways of replicating what they're doing. But we shouldn't be celebrating either high yield and high impact or low yield and low impact, let alone, in some cases, particularly ranching, low yield and high impact. That's a very worst kind of system. And unfortunately, the great majority of cattle and sheep ranching ticks that box, low yield, high impact. They kill the large predators, they exclude the trees, they exclude the wild herbivores. It's an ecological disaster.
So Joel Saladin at Polyface Farms was the guy I was thinking of earlier, and so there are these different ideas that include microbial proteins, insect protein, a shift to perennial crops, vertical farming slash indoor farming slash urban farming, which are sort of overlapping ideas. Do any of those get at this idea of high yield and low impact?
Some do, some don't. Some are much more successful than others. And, there's a lot of nonsense in this field. You have to really carefully pass, where's the nonsense, where's the good common sense. The one that hits the button most effectively is precision fermentation, growing food from microbes. So for 12,000 years, we've been using multicellular organisms, animals and plants to produce our food, and we've been breeding them and pushing them to their very limits and beyond. If you go into an intensive chicken farm or hog farm, you'll see animals push beyond their limits. But we've scarcely begun with single-celled organisms, and these are super productive and use far less in terms of land, in terms of water, in terms of fertilizer and other environmental resources. You can produce, according to one set of estimates I did, all the world's protein on an area of land the size of Greater London, our capital city in the UK, all the world's protein. And that then would enable you to release huge tracts of land for ecological restoration. That's genuine regeneration, bringing back ecosystems that we've destroyed.
What sort of food item would it be that one is consuming in that estimate?
So what it produces is a high protein flour, about 60% protein, that you can turn into almost anything. So I had it in its raw state. I was the first person in the world outside the laboratory staff to eat a pancake made of microbial flour.
Did it taste like chicken, surprisingly, as they say?
Actually, bizarrely, it tasted like a pancake.
Okay.
It really like a pancake. It was a small flip for man, and but that was just simply taking the flour made from the dead bodies of these bacteria, turning it, mixing it with a bit of wheat flour because the protein content was too high. Otherwise, you would have made an omelette. And then a bit of water, and bang, you've got a pancake. But then, because these proteins are much closer to animal proteins than plant proteins are, you can produce animal-like products much more easily, much more effectively, far less processing, tastier, cheaper, the whole lot. But you can do all sorts of other things as well. And just like the agricultural revolution produced a whole load of products that people couldn't even imagine. I mean, when the first people caught a wild cow, they weren't thinking of camembert, right? So the microbial revolution will produce endless possibilities that we can't even picture at this time. All sorts of new tastes and textures and flavors.
The last thing I want to ask you about zooms out a little bit. When there was this in many cities and states in the United States, the plastic straw debate, as we might call it, about individual restaurants saying, we're going to have paper straws, or we will use a pasta noodle as a straw, these different things. There was a blowback which said, those individual decisions are fine, but really they are almost a way not to think about where the vast emissions come from, which is industry. Yeah. Where is the balance between individual choices versus focusing on the type of activism that will make systemic change? If we think about all the way over on the individual side, all the way over on the activism only side, where is there a balance to be found that's most effective?
Well, what economic power and political power wants us to do is to think of ourselves as consumers. And say, we can make decisions, we, as consumers, we can change things through the things that we buy. Yes. And our power as consumers is always weak, partly because there are some super consumers, some mega consumers, we call them billionaires, and they have far more power than we do, and we've got absolutely no means of influencing them. And then there's multimillionaires who also have far more power than we do. And so we're really weak as consumers, and our choices are really limited anyway. And generally, the difference between them is absolutely microscopic, except for issues like whether you eat animal products or not. Cutting out animal products from your diet, that makes a huge difference. The way you travel, the way you heat your home, those are important things. Most of the rest is pretty minor. Consume less, yeah, but consume differently, you don't make that much of a difference. But as citizens, we are powerful, and demanding new systems, changes to systems, that's where our power comes in. And of course, we're just constantly discouraged from seeing ourselves that way, precisely because when we see ourselves that way, we become a threat to existing power structures. And when it comes to something like the world food system, which is coming under tremendous pressure and great threat, we have to mobilize and become active politically if we're going to intervene effectively in it.
Absolute last thing. With the new estimates that global population is actually going to peak and start to decline at some point this century, does that do anything to counteract all of the estimates that assume continued population growth beyond 2050 or 2070, whenever the estimate is? Does that actually say, hey, you know what, we actually don't need to be quite as worried about some of these things as some are?
Well, so human population growth is about the only environmental indicator which is plateauing.
Okay.
Almost all the others are going through the ceiling. And it's weird how some people still go on and on about population growth. Oh, it's population. And that's a way really of deflecting responsibility, because we, living in the rich world, consuming far more than the average global citizen, we can then point to people much poorer than ourselves, probably brown people, black people, and say, they're the problem. They're the problem because they're having too many babies. It's a way of deflecting blame and responsibility. But there is a genuine population crisis. It's a livestock population crisis, because while the human population growth has come down to below 1% a year,
yes,
a massive decline, livestock population is growing at 2.4% a year. That's a massive rate of growth. And to put it in crude terms, by 2050, there'll be an extra 100 million tons of human being on the planet and an extra 400 million tons of livestock on the planet.
Right.
They are consuming the planet. It is our livestock eating habits which are driving us to global catastrophe above anything else. So yeah, there is a population crisis, but it's not the one people are talking about.
The book is Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. We've been speaking with the book's author, George Monbiot. Really appreciate your time today very much.
Thanks, David. Great to talk to you.